Hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Standard, and I'm going to take a break from talking a bit about Akka.net and .net in general to talk about open source, which is the other half of our business. This is an issue that kind of blew up on the internet yesterday. This is a pull request going into the official Tailwind CSS repository. Tailwind is a super popular CSS framework. I personally am way too Jurassic of a front-end developer to use this. I'm still using Bootstrap like kind of a noob, but Tailwind is at least as popular as Bootstrap is, I think. And it has a very large number of users, and AI tools have been recommending it a ton. So this user submitted a pull request to basically add LLMs.txt as an endpoint to make it easier for LLMs to consume this information, both in their training data sets, but also during like real-time queries. It's kind of like adding a bots file, but for large language models. And what made this so interesting and explosive is what Adam, the creator of Tailwind, had to say in this comment down here. Now, the way Tailwind makes their money, and this is an important point I'm going to draw here, the way Tailwind makes their money is through the sales of two products. Tailwind's primary product is Tailwind Plus, which basically gets you access to templates, UI components, that sort of thing. This is sort of a standard business model for people who are in the UI business. WordPress made a lot of money through their template and component gallery and plugins for a long time. So this isn't all that novel of a business model, which there's nothing wrong with, but this is their primary source of income. And then the other sets of products they sell are the Tailwind books and video courses, refactoringui.com here. And I'll link to both of these in the description. But what Adam had to say here on this pull request is that a few days ago, he had to lay off 75% of his engineering team. Now, I'll link to my post on this. I've had to do this before at my last company, before Petabridge, that was marked up. We had to do this when we were running out of money. It is a super unpleasant, awful experience. Having to have that conversation with my board of directors at the time made me want to vomit. It was horrible. So I totally feel for Adam. It's awful. It's especially awful having to let people go through no fault of their own, right? You feel like a double failure as a business leader, that you failed to basically solve this market problem, and now it's impacting people who trusted you. It is awful. Total sympathy with him, but I understand why he had to do it. And I'll link to this too. In his podcast, he explains this in a lot more detail, sort of some of the thinking that went into it. But what I want to talk about is the commentary around how AI is impacting Adam's business. So they laid off 75% of the people on their engineering team, and here's why. 40% of the traffic to the Tailwind documentation has disappeared, largely, we can assume, as a result of large language models. And the reason why this is important is that this is how people find out about their commercial products. It's the entrance to their sales funnel. I understand this. The Akka.net documentation and the Petabridge website are the entrance to our sales funnel as well. I completely get it. But the issue here is that adoption has been taking off faster and faster, but revenue is down 80%. So if he makes LLM adoption easier for Tailwind, this might accelerate the cycle that's damaging his business. This presents a conundrum for him as an open source author and also as a businessman. What do I do when this disruptive technology is eating my lunch? How am I supposed to respond to that? And what should I do about pull requests like this that threaten to accelerate that even further? Now, the response online to this news, a lot of people were very sympathetic for Adam's situation because he explained it in really human, poignant terms. But the overall sort of technical conversation about the role of open source in a future where large language models can commodify code and expertise. What role do open source libraries play in a future like that? Now, Jeffrey Huntley, and I'll link to this piece in the description too, wrote this back in August of last year, so he's not talking directly about Tailwind at all here. But the thrust of this article is, what's the point of even having open source libraries now that you can just generate them? That essentially, why would I want to deal with other people's opinions that are all institutionalized in this code when I could rather make something bespoke at effectively zero marginal cost? It's already baked into the price of my Claude Code subscription, right? Why would I bother doing that? And he's by far and away not the only person to have this take. There was this thread yesterday talking a bit about essentially that open source sponsorships and the whole business model around trying to attract people to your company. That might still be viable using open source as a marketing mechanism, but the idea of monetizing open source is somewhat anemic and was always hard to begin with. I agree with that. but is essentially a dead end. That AI is going to bulldoze everyone in that path. And this is kind of all in line with the sort of more meta principle of software engineering as an industry is dying as a result of the inevitable takeover by artificial intelligence. Where I want to segue here is to talk a little bit about our own statistics and the stats of some other projects that I took a look at in preparation for this post. I put a long blog post together based on some data I had to culminate for our end of year review. Every year here at Petabridge, I spend 2 or 3 days digging through all of our stats: marketing performance, performance of our open source technology, counting the number of releases, sales, finance, all that jazz. So when I saw this incident happen, I had just finished compiling that data. And when I saw takes like these, and by the way, I'm not picking on Dimitri here. There were thousands of takes like this all over Twitter. So he's not alone thinking about any of that. But what I want to point out is that AI is absolutely not killing open source. It might be hurting some open source businesses, and I'll make that distinction in a moment, but it's actually accelerating growth and adoption for us in a very visible and easily felt way. And I'm going to link to the companion blog post that has all the facts and figures in writing, so you can look at that too after this. All right, so here's our blog post, and I'm just running this locally off of my Jekyll instance here, since I like to publish this at the same time the video goes live, which obviously I'm filming right now. But the basic gist of this is that the idea that basically AI can generate these open source components, and therefore these open source components have no intrinsic value anymore, and we should just do away with them, is perfectly backwards, both from how large language models actually function. Large language models are driving massive open source installation volume, which is something that Adam mentions explicitly in his GitHub issue. And I can see this in our own adoption statistics for Akka.net as well. And I took a look at some other data sources, and that's the same trend showing up everywhere. And I'll explain why that is in just a moment. But the other thing is that the inherent value that an open source component has is still vastly higher than some little crap that Claude Code can emit for you on the fly that attempts to replace something fairly complex and venerable like RabbitMQ or MongoDB or Akka.net. Let's dive into some of the data here. This is a chart depicting our annual downloads by year. And to kind of put this in perspective for you, this isn't measuring like the total cumulative size of our install base. This is measuring like the changes in growth every year. So in 2021, we clocked about 2.2 million installs that year. 2022, it was 2.62. So that's like a 19% growth rate year over year. And then in 2023, it was 3.68 million. We did a major release of Akka.net that year. It's when Akka.net 1.5 came out. And that's what drove all of that growth, probably, was the introduction of all those new packages and features there. We are still trying to get Akka.net 1.6 designed and delivered, so we haven't done that in a few years, which is, that's typical. But if we go down here a little bit further, we're still in the process of trying to get Akka.net 1.6 delivered. That's something I'm hoping we get done this year. But the next thing to take a look at here is 2024. We had a fairly modest increase in adoption here. But bam, we're back to 2023 levels of growth. And bear in mind, this is with a much larger baseline too. So in absolute terms, this is by far the biggest increase we've ever seen. Now, I think there's two factors that really drove this for our business. The first is I think we've done a lot better with YouTube and helping people get around, let's say, certain adoption barriers. I also think redoing Akka.net Bootcamp, which you can check out here, helped a lot too. We did all that very early in 2025. But the second thing that's helped a lot, and I've seen it show up time and time again in my conversations with people who converted into customers, is that the adoption of LLM coding tools is accelerating the rate at which people are able to actually start using our open source. In other words, it's compressing the learning curve quite a bit, which is very advantageous for libraries like mine, where Akka.net's a fairly alien concept compared to what your average .NET developer is used to. We have to put together a lot of training and marketing materials to help them overcome that. Well, LLMs basically commodify that to zero and can get you up and running right away without us having to do a huge amount of additional legwork or evangelism. And we are definitely riding that wave here. And you can see Tailwind CSS is doing the same. They went from 481 million downloads in 2024 to over a billion. And I think this is the cumulative total. Let me take a look. This is their NPM statistics. And you can see their downloads per week starting from 2024 through the end of 2025. So they're averaging somewhere like, in 2024, let's say on a Friday, that's 1.1 million. And then is this a Sunday down here? Yeah, well, no one cares about weekend numbers. That's why this has the sawtooth shape. But basically, they're doing around, let's say at the beginning of the year, 1.1, 1.4. This is going up and up and up and up. So we start hitting about 2 million towards the end of the year. Well, the peaks this year keep going up, and then there's an even bigger jump right around April 2025, where you're seeing 4 million, 3.8 million, and it goes higher and higher and higher. What happened right around April 2025? This is, I believe, when Claude Code got introduced. In other words, the sort of explosion of much more comprehensive. In fact, let me double check the date on that. Yeah, there we go. So this is from Anthropic's own blog. Claude Code came online May 2025. So if you take a look at the download chat here, this is happening, yes. So right around towards, let's say, the end of April, beginning of May. So I personally started using tools like Cursor pretty heavily right around here. And with the proliferation of more models like Claude Sonnet, I think 3.5 was the cat's meow around then. All these sorts of tools help drive adoption quite a bit for Tailwind. But Tailwind's not the only one who's seen this adoption. We've seen it as well. And if we scroll down here, let's take a look at good old NServiceBus in particular. Now, what makes NServiceBus interesting is it's a commercial library and has been for like over a decade at least. And, the gist of that is that if you're Jeffrey Huntley or one of these other developers and you're thinking, well, I want these capabilities, but I don't want to have to pay a licensing fee or do business with Particular, the company that makes it, I'm going to go ahead and have Claude invent my own. This would be a prime candidate for doing that. Yet their growth rate basically remains more or less unchanged year over year. They went from 35 million to 47.8 million cumulative installs in 2024, and they did 47.8 million to 64.6 million installs, which is a slight dip in the relative growth rate, but best year they've ever seen in absolute terms. If you were expecting AI to go ahead and replace all these off-the-shelf components, NServiceBus would be like the first casualty of something like that. But they're not. The basic gist of this from a principle standpoint is that there's a couple factors here that are going to basically make it so there's a flywheel effect here, where LLMs are actually going to drive open source adoption much further than it would probably on its own momentum. I mean, open source was already eating the world. It's going to be multiplied by probably another order of magnitude with LLM-assisted coding driving a lot of the production of new applications going forward. And here's why that is. Now, I don't have a nice diagram to illustrate this for you, so I'm just going to reference what's in the blog. But generally speaking, the way large language models perform reasoning is very alien looking compared to how humans think. Now, there's various different ways they're trained, but largely it's based on reward functions. You take a verifiable training set and you go ahead and you throw an LLM at it and try to basically figure out what sets of weights and measures produce the best scores, where you have a input and then you have a verifiable outcome at the end, etc. This is basically trying to produce the shortest possible path to a working solution the most often. And there's a variety of different factors that LLM researchers might account for. Might not always be about the shortest path, but generally speaking, they are trying to complete a goal as expeditiously as they can. That would be a general truism that I think most AI researchers would agree with. Now, I asked Claude to go ahead and help me build a distributed system for, let's say, I'll use a real example from our customers, a trade order capture system for like a foreign exchange trading system that a large European bank uses. Well, I could generate thousands of lines of custom code, implement my own homespun actor model or my own homespun AMQP broker or whatever the case may be, build all that from scratch, test all the network protocols, implement a fixed support and all that stuff, and you basically own all of that completely. Or I could just install Akka using .NET add package Akka and start building on top of that immediately. The LLM is always going to pick option B because this basically, via its reward function, gets it closest from A to B. And this also matches, by the way, what is actually in their training sets. Here's where I've got a little diagram for you. One of the biggest advantages of open source is that because of all the Stack Overflow questions, the documentation, the GitHub issues, the source code being available, all of the blog posts and conference talks, and the public code samples that are all available on the internet, all of these have been incorporated into the training data that companies like Anthropic and OpenAI use for training these frontier models that are good at coding. So if you have a popular open source project, that's going to have a lot more training data than private or closed solutions. The LLMs are going to start recommending it more because it appears more often in some of their own weights and biases, which is going to result in more users actually adopting it, which will create more examples of any of that, even if a small fraction of that gets published back online somewhere, which is going to help drive more popularity of the open source project. That's why you can see these up and to the right spikes in adoption in projects like Akka.net and Tailwind. So this flywheel effect is going to, if anything, drive more open source adoption and make open source projects even more popular than they already are. So the idea that AI is going to replace these is probably much more of an exception than a rule. The other thing that's worth bearing in mind in terms of what impacted Tailwind's business is you got to think about, and I'm going to do a separate video, by the way, on open source monetization, since that's another topic in and of itself. But here's essentially another reason why AI is going to really help drive more open source adoption. So the biggest cost of adopting open source is learning it. It's figuring out, what is this project for? How is it licensed? Does it suit my needs? How do I configure it? How do I deploy it? What are the gotchas, et cetera, et cetera? Well, for a human, that might mean months of work potentially. For a large language model that's already codified most of that information into its training data set already, and anything that's newer, it can go in Google and Grok pretty quickly. The learning curve is already priced in to the way these large language models work. They don't need to go and do a step-by-step Akka.net tutorial to start using it. They can just synthesize one in a single shot. And that is a huge advantage for being able to get up and running with third-party technologies. To give you an example, I mentioned Termina in my last video. I've never directly worked with reactive extensions before in my life, and I've also never written a source generator before. I used Claude Code to implement both of those in the library, and I gave it some pretty good, TDD sort of specifications for how to test and verify it. Worked great, got up and running, and I was able to actually go and learn and appreciate how it worked after I actually had something functioning in my hands already. That's very impressive, and that's an example of how large language models really compress that learning curve quite a bit. Now, the next thing I wanted to kind of touch on is not all libraries are going to be impacted, or not all libraries and open source technologies are going to be impacted the same way by open source. A concept that's intrinsically useful is the notion of blast radius, which is basically how much damage can this component malfunctioning cause inside my business. So the difference between, let's say, a CSS framework and a distributed database is readily apparent here, right? If I have a minor CSS rendering issue, that's going to be an inconvenience at best. If I have, let's say, a situation where my database can start corrupting data or can start dropping information or not persist things in a consistent manner, that's like a real business critical problem that I am going to spend hard cash money to solve if I'm a business owner. So if you're on the wrong side of the blast radius equation, where your software has a low blast radius, maybe it makes sense for a large language model to go ahead and replace that. But if you're on the side of the aisle that I'm on, where Akka.net's very much a high blast radius technology, if we go ahead and immediately disrupt our wire format or our persistence format, we're going to get phone calls about it within a day, where essentially they're going to say, hey, as soon as we upgraded, our application stopped working, and now we can't process, real-time transit data for a global shipping network or whatever, right? We're going to hear about that. So that's another sort of facet of this equation about whether or not AI is going to replace open source that needs to be borne in mind, which is that if you are building your own homespun solutions, you're now responsible for 100% of that blast radius. Would you go ahead and basically build a distributed database and built entirely by Claude Code? Probably not. Reason being is that, it has zero institutionalized experience. No one has used this before but me. It's one of the reasons why when you're building, open source technologies or new programming languages or new databases, you probably don't want to be the first production user of that technology. You want to let someone else go first. Well, if you're rolling everything yourself, this is now your problem. Now, you can take a religious attitude here and believe that the AI will just improve and fix this just because, to which I say, good luck to you. Or you can do what the AI and LLM agents are already doing, which is leveraging the institutionalized experience that's codified into the code base. Because when you install a package like Akka.net, you're not just getting source code. You're getting decades of bug fixes, institutionalized knowledge, performance fixes, platform-specific quirks, all these little learnings that took someone a lot of pain and time and trouble to fix are all codified and institutionalized into that code. And large language models already intrinsically appreciate that, not for the same reasons we do. Their reasoning is very alien, like I mentioned, if you can even call it reasoning. But the basic gist of this is that they're not going to go and write homespun solutions just because. Grand scheme of things here, I'm not going to go ahead and read everything else. AI is not killing open source. It's actually creating a golden age of open source consumption where I expect there to be a pretty virtuous flywheel effect that's going to result in our adoption increasing even more this year. And ultimately, there's a lot of things we should probably be doing differently to lean into that. Maybe getting an LLMs.txt on the Akka.net documentation should be a much higher priority than it is right now. That would probably benefit us quite a bit and turn Claude and ChatGPT into evangelists for Akka.net. That would be a good idea. So the other thing I wanted to mention down here is that Tailwind CSS isn't dying. Tailwind Plus might be. And that's what we're going to touch on in the next blog post and the next video, which I'm going to try to get out next week. We're going to talk about the impact that artificial intelligence is having on open source business models like ours. And in our case, our subscription business grew 20% in 2025. And AI-driven adoption likely helped with that. So rather than it hurting us, it actually helped us quite a bit. We'll talk about why the difference between our business and Tailwind's in the next video. Thanks for watching. Well, that'll do it for this video. If you found this video useful, please don't forget to check the description to find links to other resources we may have included. So blog posts, GitHub code samples, other videos, so on. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. We'll catch you next time. Thank you very much.